Welcome, Westside. We are studying the book of Genesis. We are in chapters 12 through 50. We're covering the life of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and of course, in the story of Joseph. Joseph is not one of the patriarchs, but his story is integral to the formation of the nation. We're beginning with Abram, or Abraham. I may go back and forth of saying it in our study today is when his name is changed, so we'll be on Abraham after that. But Abram was called from Ur of the Chaldees in chapter 12. He made his way in the Fertile Crescent, remember, that we looked at on our map, to Haran, and then down into the land of Canaan. Lot separated from him. I remember going to the cities of the plain, and that's important in the story because it seems that Lot is, at that point, the presumed heir of childless Abraham. In this story today, as we'll get to it, he chooses his chief steward, which was common in the ancient world at that time. We know from archaeological finds that have been found. Thank goodness they wrote on clay, fired in brick kilns, and of course that is permanent, and those writings have been deciphered, and we have much information about ancient times in the Mesopotamian, in the region that Abram lived and operated in the very time period that he was alive. So we'll be talking about some of those customs today. But then you remember that the four kings came and captured Lot. They came from the region of Babylon, where Iraq is today, captured Lot and the peoples that were in Sodom, and took them captive. Of course, Abram pursued them with his own trained army, as we talked about last week, and others that went with him that were allied with him among the Hittites, and brought everyone back, and then the meeting of Melchizedek. And that's where we begin today in chapter 15. I hope you've read the material already and answered questions, and of course, email me if you have anything that you want me to address or answer. If I can do that in an email, or if I need to think it's important enough, I need to do it on the video for everyone, we'll do so. After these things is how chapter 15 begins, so obviously connecting to the battle that had been fought. And God says to Abram immediately, "Fear not, Abram, I am your shield, your reward shall be very great," or "I'm your exceeding great reward," your version may say. Well, why fear not? Why did he say that? The chapter doesn't seem to be connected back to Abram's fear that these kings now will come and retaliate, but to the context of the chapter itself, and that is his childlessness. It was considered a great evil in that day, not to have an heir, not to have a child of your own, particularly as we'll find out to a woman. In Sarah's case, it was a great shame to do that, to not be able to provide an heir to her husband. So he tries to appeal to God that Eleazar of Damascus, his chief steward, will be his heir. And he says, no, one from your own body, literally at verse 4, from your own loins. So we know now that Abraham will have an heir that comes from him. Now, nothing is mentioned of Sarah, so that plays into the story of Hagar and Ishmael that's coming up, because again, Ishmael was from Abraham, but not from Sarah. But God's going to have something more to say about that in chapter 17. He even took Abram out at verse 5 and says, look at the number of the stars, as he looked out on a night that any of us could do. And he said, can you number them? So will your offspring be. In chapter 13, 16, you remember that he said, go out and, well, basically the dust of the earth, and so shall your offspring be. And both of these imageries, obviously, you can't number either one of them. So we know that Abraham is, through Ishmael, through the sons of Keturah, the father of the Arab nations. He's the father of the Jewish nation. And Paul says, he is the father of all Christians. He is our father, in Romans the 4th chapter, of the faithful because of his great faith in God. And I think that's the idea of looking up the stars. A lot of commentators have suggested that nobler, loftier idea that his offspring are going to be a spiritual people. And then verse 6, a very important passage in the Bible. You need to underline this in your Bible if you have not, because it plays into the New Testament as well. And he, Abram, believed the Lord, and he, the Lord, counted it to him, to Abram, as righteousness. So what that means is that Abram trusted God. It's more than just believing. It's the idea of he counted God true, trustworthy, reliable. What God promised, even a seed that will come from his own body, he believed that. And not just one time. As Leopold and others have suggested, there is a device in Hebrew that means that Abram believed constantly. He was firmly fixed on the God, the true and the living God, and what he had spoken to him. So that's the importance here, that ongoing belief that is ongoing obedience, because both are hand in hand. You must do what God says. In fact, he will say that later to him. We will find in chapter 17, walk before me and be blameless. Your conduct before God is important too. Righteousness is the only thing that can stay in the presence of God. And because we have sinned, we're no longer righteous. And no matter how much good we do after that, say we decide not to sin anymore, if that was possible to say we would not sin anymore, no matter all the good we do after that, it cannot take away the sin that we have done against God. And therefore, only righteousness can dwell in his presence. God takes instead of that our belief in him, our obedience to him. And in the New Testament, of course, that will be the belief in the work of Jesus Christ and obeying the gospel of Jesus Christ. So at verses 7 and 8, he tells him, I am the Lord who brought you out of the Ur of the Chaldees. And Abraham at that point says, how am I to know? And I don't think that seems almost like, well, he just believed, and you just said that means he counted him trustworthy. Is he now doubting him? I think it's more here the idea, if we may illustrate from a wedding. Two people have agreed to marry one another. They have had long conversations and have come to that idea that they will spend the rest of their days honoring one another, loving one another, and that they will not depart from one another. They're not going to commit sexual immorality with someone else. How do you trust them? Even in our culture, we exchange tokens of those vows. We even, as a preacher, I've done many weddings, and I say those very words. You have a token of your vows, and we have rings that the one party puts on the hand of the opposite spouse, or to the spouse, and says to them the words of the vows that I pronounce, that I have them repeat. In essence, the rings are to be reminders to both parties, a visual confirmation, an affirmation of the great vow that was just taken when they said, I do. I will do exactly the words that were spoken, and for better, for worse, and richer, or poor, and so forth. So serious, serious matters. And I think that's exactly what Abraham is doing here. He's asking, what, I believe you, but how do I know this? What sign are you going to give? And that's going to be important, because God does in this do an extraordinary thing. He says to him, bring me, verses 9 through 11. And there is a heifer that's 3 years old, a female goat, and a 3-year-old ram, and then a turtle dove and a pigeon. The larger animals, he cleaves them in half. He cuts them in two and spreads them apart to make a pathway. And while this seems very, very odd to us, it fits many a ritual covenant in the ancient Near East. At this time, again, as I told you, there have been many cuneiform tablets, those clay tablets have discovered of their writings, and so we know much about the culture that Abraham grew up in at the very time that he grew up in. This kind of thing was used to ratify a covenant. And the point of it was that these animals had they were not a sacrifice. You didn't burn them on an altar, but they had sacrificed their life. And and the blood must have, you can imagine, two people in a covenant would walk between those pieces. And in effect, they said, let happen to us, if we do not keep this covenant, let what has happened to these animals happen to us. And so it's very, very interesting that when a covenant was made, it was called to cut a covenant. And the Hebrew uses that word at verse 18 of chapter 15. When here it's translated, on that day the Lord made a covenant with Abraham. The word made there, it wouldn't make any sense to us to say cut. He cut it with him. But if you understand what has just happened and what their ancient society did, it should be translated cut a covenant, because it's that idea of let happen to me what happened to these animals if I do not keep the covenant. Abraham goes into a very deep sleep fell upon him at verse 12. It's still part of the vision, a prophetic sleep in which a dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. And in the midst of that, he is told about his progeny is going to spend 400 years captives in a nation that will mistreat them And of course, we know that is Egypt and what is coming. But God says, I will bring them into judgment. And again, the nature of God is being displayed to us in this book. We just pick it up as we go along at different times. And that means that God judges every nation. He has the right to. He created all peoples. I will bring judgment on that nation. And the Israelites will come out with great possessions, and they did in Exodus 12:35 through 39, even though they had been badly mistreated. The iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full, he says. The Amorites were the largest tribe of the Canaanites that occupied the land of Palestine at that time, and so many times they're just taken as for the whole of all the tribes that are there. And the Amorites, the iniquity of them is not yet full, meaning that there reaches a point where God knows a nation has nothing good left in them. There's nothing but judgment that can fall upon a nation because of its terrible wickedness and iniquity. And yet that cup was not yet full. You have Melchizedek in Jerusalem. Who else was in the land of Palestine at that time? There may have been a few more like Melchizedek who followed the one true and living God. But the day would come later in which now Joshua would enter the land and conquer those people. Again, all nations are subject to Yahweh. These nations, the Canaanite nations, are subject to him, and based upon their moral behavior, based upon how they treat God. What we're told then is that instead of Abram and God both passing through the parts, it's only God that does. It says a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed through those pieces. And obviously that must stand for God, who is making the covenant with Abraham. It's interesting that later God does appear as fire to the children of Israel. Remember the pillar of fire by night that was over the tabernacle? And in chapter 19, when he descended on Sinai, it says the smoke ascended like the smoke of a furnace, and the fire on the top of the mountains, and the thunder and the rumbling, and God's great voice that came forth from it, that nobody could touch the mount. So you remember that God used that imagery of fire and smoke later. Again, no image can be drawn of God. He's not to be likened to anything because he is spirit. But God, in effect, walks between the two pieces. And here's the really remarkable thing. He invokes the curses upon himself if he does not keep what he said. It's impossible for God to lie. By two immutable things, the Hebrew author says, when God makes a promise, he is not going to lie anyway, but he swears by himself. In effect, here he's passing through the pieces, swearing that the curse of that should fall on him if he does not do. Go over and read Jeremiah chapter 34, and that's many, many centuries from now, but they are still doing that same ancient Near Eastern custom of dividing an animal and walking through their covenant that the princes and the leaders of Judah had made with their slaves. And it's a very, very interesting passage because it bears light on this, that they were calling the curses down on themselves, and God was watching, and God was telling them that's exactly what would happen to them. So we need to remember that that's what God is doing here. The promises were to come first and foremost through the hand of God. Abram could do nothing about bringing that nation to pass. He's only going to ever have one son in his life, in Ishmael, of course, I know, but Isaac, the one that is promised, and never will see the numbers of people. Jacob won't see the numbers of people. And all of that will be by God's hand and later in bringing them out of the land of Canaan. All right, chapter 16 begins with Sarai. And Abram's wife had borne him no children, and she had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarah said to Abram, behold, now the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go in to my servant. It may be that I should obtain children by her. And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. Now, again, this is something that would have been very common in the ancient Near East. If a man could not, a wife of a man could not provide him an heir, lots of the legal codes of that time that we find in the digs in various places that were contemporary with Abraham, and so that Abraham was operating by a law that was well known throughout the entire region, the greater region of that area, that he could the wife could give him a concubine, basically a secondary wife. She never had first place like the wife, his one true wife, but that one could bear a child that would be adopted by the mistress, basically. In other words, provided by her because she gave Hagar to him, and that would be a very common thing that you would see in the ancient Near East. It may seem very strange to us. The Lord has prevented me, she says, from bearing children. Isn't it interesting that the early matriarchs, as we would say, not only Sarah, but we'll find Rebecca and Rachel, unable to bear children, and yet that promise is to come to them. It's as if God is restraining in order to teach faith and endurance in the families that make up what we call the opening families of the children of Israel. Verse 3, she gave her to Abram as husband, to her husband as wife. So concubines were considered as secondary wives. Ward says the institution of the surrogate maternity to which she resorts is by no means her invention, but being well attested in the ancient Near Eastern legal documents. And many others tell the same thing as I've said to you already. So Abram listened to the voice of Sarah. Now, this is going to wreak havoc, and it was not the plan that God had at all. And yet God is going to end up and bless Ishmael, the son that will come from Hagar and Abram. At this point, before we're too hard on these people, remember they are operating under the laws and customs they know. God is revealing his will to them, but how much has been revealed at this point, we don't know. We don't have any record other than what we can read. And that is not telling us much about, did he reveal about marriage and about all of those kinds of things that later God's laws speak very specifically to. And so they are operating under the confines of what they have, or that they know, and under the legal things that the honorable things that they are familiar with. Before we get too hard on Sarah, is she just by faith trying to provide for Abram? Again, remember, all he knows at this point, all we have is that, no, you're going to have one by your body. It's not going to be said about Sarah until chapter 17, that it'll come through both Sarah and Abram. So it could be at this point, before we get too hard on her and think she's done something terrible, that she is providing for that in a very honorable way in her culture, that Abram from his own body, because we know that part of the thing has been said by God, would bring forth an heir, and not somebody that would just be a legal heir who's not from Abram's body. Hagar conceives. Now, it wasn't what God wished. It's not what God was looking to. We know that because of what he has in store and in plan that we know. But Hagar then looks down, we are told, with contempt on her mistress. It may have been something like a boastful feeling that God's given me what he withheld from you. And maybe that would exalt her in a position that obviously she could. So Sarah takes great umbrage at this, and at verse 5 even blames Abraham, if you look at the words, for what she initiated. But again, ancient Near Eastern legal codes allowed a surrogate marriage, but it always offered protection to the mistress, to the first wife. A slave could not claim equality to the mistress. And so that was long-standing as well. And if Abram somehow had allowed this to happen by not saying what needed to be said, again, he just acquiesces. He said, she's your slave, your servant, treat her or do with her as you wish. In verse 6 it says, Sarah dealt harshly with her. Interesting, that same word is how Egypt will deal with the children of Israel. She fled from her, Hagar does, because of that. And thus, as one has said, and Kyle did in Kyle and Delitz's commentary, thus instead of securing the fulfillment of their wishes, Sarah and Abram had to reap nothing but grief and vexation, and apparently had lost the maid through their self-concerted scheme. So it seems like it's come to naught. She is in the wilderness by a well, in the wilderness of Shur, and she is going toward Egypt. Shur means fortification, so we're well known that the Egyptians had fortifications toward Palestine, and she is approaching the only place she knows to flee to is where she had grown up as an Egyptian. At verse 7, we're introduced to a personage in the Bible that you will see again and again. This is the first time. The angel of the Lord. And the word Lord, there's all caps, so it means Yahweh, Jehovah, your version may have. It's the covenant name of God. The angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. Now, this is not just any angel of God. There are other times that you're going to have angels come down, Jacob, and seeing the angels go back and forth. That's not this one. This is a particular person and a specific messenger. You know, the word angel means messenger. It can be human or celestial. In this case, we understand from heaven. Who betrays God, though. This one is very different. Who betrays God and often speaks as God himself. In fact, Hagar understands that this has been God, that she has seen God. And so it is very different from what you encounter. Now, there's a lot of discussion about who this is. Is this the Word, as we know him before he came to be Jesus the Christ, came to the earth and became in human form? We know that he followed Israel in the wilderness, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10. There's just a lot of speculation. You can do your own study of that. We won't take the time away from the main story to comment on it here. But this one tells her, return and submit. Hagar, it's not right. You return and submit to your mistress, and I will bless you. And again, that flows from Abram. Remember, Abram is going to be blessed. And therefore, because Ishmael is his son, the blessing of nations are going to come through to Abraham. Kings will be born to him. And that will be true of Ishmael. Ishmael will have 12 princes. Isn't that interesting? 12 princes, Jacob later, 12 tribes of Israel. Ishmael is to be his name. God gave her the name. And it means God hears. Isn't that interesting? Constant reminder to Ishmael, though he doesn't turn out to be a follower of God. It appears that Hagar is, to some degree, accepting of who this God is that she has seen in the house of Abraham, or heard of in the house of Abraham, and now knows firsthand. It's going to be a constant reminder in the very name of her son that God heard her and the cry that she had, of course, and the angst that she is in. When he talks about what Ishmael will be like, he said his hand will be against everyone and everyone's hand against him, and he will dwell over against his kinsman. He's going to be a wild donkey of a man. Some have commented on that as being the kind of idea of just a hard-headed kind of person. Others see the donkey as a wild and free, and I'll let you wrestle with that in the commentaries. But obviously, what is said about his hand against everyone and everyone's hand against him, he is going to be independent of the Israelites, but he's going to dwell over against them, near them. That Abram's going to be a progenitor of the Muslim world, as we know today, partially through Ishmael, partially through the sons of Keturah later after Sarah dies, and through Isaac are going to come the Israelite nation, or the Jews as we understand today, and by extension, the Christians who look to Abraham as their father too. And as one has rightly said, to this day, the conflict prophesied to Hagar rages on. You are, she said, a god of seeing. Very fascinating. The only recorded instance of a person giving a name to God in the Bible is Hagar naming God here and saying, you are a god of seeing. And she acknowledges, therefore, that God cares and that God is seeing and that God hears. Powerful lesson for us. The Bible says to us as Christians in 1 Peter 5:7 to cast all our care upon Jesus, for he cares for us. God is watching you now. He knows what you're going through. He knows and sees and never think that he doesn't care. The love of God on the cross of Jesus Christ forever should say to us, he cares intensely for us. And here was this little slave woman who had left her mistress, who had mistreated her so badly in the same kind of language that the Egyptians would later mistreat the children of Israel. And yet God is aware of her and knows who she is. So Ishmael, we are told in verse 15, is born into Abram's house, is named by Abram himself, whether God had spoken to him later about that or Hagar told him, fathered by Abram. So he will be fully reckoned to be Abram's son, and Abram, it's going to be hard for him not to focus on Ishmael as his heir, because to the point that we we are now in the story. He only knows, God has only said, no, from your loins will come, not necessarily Sarah as the mother, but from you. And so it's easy to see why Abram would believe this. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael. So 11 years after they leave Haran. Remember, he was 75 and now he's 86. Okay, fast forward the story. We're to the next chapter, chapter 17. When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared. So lots of things had to happen in their life and in their journeys and all that they moved around Palestine. We're told nothing about famines, nothing about all that has happened. We just fast forward. Now we're 24 years after he left Haran to Canaan. Ishmael is 13 years old now. And Sarah hasn't provided an heir. And so there's more years of just becoming impossible now for Sarah to bear a son. And God appears to him and says, I am God Almighty, El Shaddai. Two ways that that's been looked at, either the powerful, strong one or the one who suffices. Obviously, what does he produce? What is he capable of? The idea is again the same. God is able to make the barren fertile and to fulfill his promises no matter what it looks like physically. God can compel nature to do what is contrary to itself. But he says to Abraham, and we need to connect this to the covenant language, walk before me. A God-conscious life is needed. A biblical life, we are saying, listening to God, obeying God. In Genesis 18:19, God will say of Abram that he will instruct his house in the statutes that God teaches and in all the judgments that God reveals to him. There are lots of things, folks, that we don't know. God is teaching Abraham, and yet it's just not recorded if it's not in the pages of Genesis or somewhere else in the Holy Word. Joseph's reaction, remember, to Potiphar, how can I do this great sin against God if I commit adultery with you? How did he know that was a great sin against God unless God had revealed that? To walk before God, as Waltke says, means to orient one's entire life to his presence, promise, and demands. There's so many people that live in life that have nothing to do with God. They don't give a thought to God. They go about their life. They love their families. They're decent people. We live next door to them, but they could care less. They're not thinking about God. They're not walking before God. And the second part of that is be blameless. Walk before me and be blameless. That doesn't mean sinlessness, but it means faithful observance of all God commands, a conscientious conduct. And when one does sin, to offer sacrifice in the Old Testament to wash that away. The Hebrew signifies a wholeness of relationship and integrity rather than the idea of no sin. Again, Waltke. At verse 2, notice he says, that I may make my covenant between me and you and may multiply you greatly. Here's the third time that we are seeing in chapter 12, the beginning of that covenant. We just saw it in chapter 15 with the dividing of the pieces. Now, once again, making it. But here the idea of making it is going to be finally where Isaac is going to really come from, and that is Abraham and Sarah. My covenant in this chapter, or the word covenant rather, is used 13 times in chapter 17. So just count them up yourself. Between me and you, he is making that. And so it's the same covenant that promises a great offspring, promises the great land that will be given to them that he is dwelling in Canaan, and that through him all nations of the earth will be blessed. Abram falls on his face in verse 3, worship and honor. Abram, as one said, in a gesture more powerful than words, humbles himself before God, and his willingness to listen is absolute. In verse 4 and 5, he changes Abram's name to Abraham. Abram means exalted father, but because of the promise he has made that a great company of people are going to come from you, a great multitude, he is now changed to mean father of many, or a multitude. And so think about that. Here's a man who only has Ishmael, who has no one by Sarah, his real wife, and yet 99 years old, beyond the time that he can. How incongruous that must have sounded to him at that point. And yet, as we know, back in chapter 15:6, he believes God, he trusts God. Now, verses 7 and 8, God says, I'll make an everlasting covenant. You have a special study that I have attached and sent to you about the Hebrew word here. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, olam. That does not mean ever. We think of everlasting meaning eternal, never-ending time. But that's not what the Hebrew word means. It means long duration of time, somewhere in the distant, hidden future. But it did not mean eternal, as we think about never-ending time. The idea, again, an everlasting possession. Out of these kinds of passages has come premillennial theory, in which the nation, the modern nation of the Israelis, were granted that land again in 1947, and then in 48 defeated the Arab nations that came against them, and other wars that have been fought, and the ongoing battle that's in that area. To believe that they have an everlasting right to that land is simply not right. That's not what the Bible teaches. And you cannot get that out of the meaning of the word that is translated everlasting, even though that's what everlasting means to us in the first definition you can look at in a dictionary. But look at the second definition. Read my special study that I sent you, and it'll give you more details and practical passages that clearly demonstrate it doesn't mean eternally. In verses 9 through 14, a sign is given to Abraham to secure this covenant, and that sign is that every male among you shall be circumcised. Circumcision is not the covenant itself, even though it is referred to that way here. The designation of circumcision itself as a covenant, Hamilton says, is a synecdoche, and that means a part is put for the whole. In other words, if you are circumcised, then you are agreeing to keep the entirety of the covenant obligation. And this is the aspect of the covenant that you must keep. You must be circumcised. And so circumcision is the sign, verse 11, of the covenant. In effect, God's brand mark. Abraham and his male descendants are to keep this on the 8th day of a baby's birth. After this, that male baby is to be circumcised. He answers these questions. What? The flesh of your foreskin. The why? It is the sign of the covenant. When males are 8 days old, born in your house, or even a foreigner that is bought as a slave in the house, had to be circumcised. Again, the who, the people we just mentioned. And what if you're not circumcised, you're to be cut off from your people. Just as that foreskin was cut off and thrown away, this idea is if you don't obey this, if sign of the covenant that says, in effect, like we talked about a minute ago, the rings of a wedding, reminding people of the great covenant vows they have taken, and that they're to be wholly concerned about one another and never commit sexual immorality with someone else. We understand the sanctity of marriage. He is saying the same here. The sanctity of this covenant, the reminder to the Israelites, was to be the sign that is occurring here. But God was not thinking about the physical mainly. Many times, and it's born into the New Testament, it's the circumcision of the heart. Again, look at Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 16, and Deuteronomy chapter 30 and verse 6. That's Deuteronomy 10, 16, and chapter 30, verse 6. For times that God refers to the circumcision of the heart, that's what he was really after in this physical thing that they were to do. But they were to do it. They were to do the physical thing. Sarai's name is now changed to Sarah. They both mean princess, so we don't know really what the new change is like we do with Abraham. But she is brought into the covenant now and is made the promise that through her and Abraham will come the son, that the offspring, this multitude of offspring will come, by which God blesses the world eventually with the single seed, as we know from the book of Galatians. And Abraham, when he hears that, falls on his face and laughs and says, shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old, and shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? So we know, even though ages were, you remember we saw this earlier, that people probably look much younger than they were at the ages that we count that at. Even now, when somebody was 99 in Abraham's day, or 90, that was beyond childbearing time. There comes a time in a woman's life, and we understand that in our culture, that it's beyond the time that naturally, under natural means, a woman could bear a child. And so Abraham, we are told, laughs at this. Does he laugh because of far-fetchedness of it? Or is it, as some have suggested, because of joy? Or as I might suggest, the mixture of it. I don't believe God is here. She, as we'll learn later about Sarah, that Abraham is laughing in doubt. He is laughing in just the unbelievable wonder. How could this be? And maybe there is still, because he is focused on Ishmael, remember, for 13 years. So he says to God immediately, oh, that Ishmael may live before you, that may be my heir. He comes from my body. No, God says, from Sarah and you, but Sarah your wife shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. And Isaac, by the way, means laughter. As for Ishmael, I have heard you. That was the meaning of Ishmael's name. God hears. And so he will establish his covenant with Isaac, but of course he will bless Ishmael. That three-part covenant that was made with Abraham, the land, the great offspring, and then the offspring, the one that will come that will bless all nations of the earth. God chose Isaac and not Ishmael. Not by natural generation, but by supernatural grace, as Waltke says. That very day, Abraham, we are told, immediately obeyed. I'll tell you, that would not have been easy to fulfill. You imagine thinking a full 14 years before this, he had 318 trained men born in his house to go to battle. That's what I think it's saying to us. They were men that were doing that all the time. That was their occupation, to defend Abram and his household. How many people did he have? How many men did he have? It's been estimated he could have had 1,000 men at that time. Now we are that was that many years ago. Now we are this many years in advance of that. There could have been upwards of 1,000, 2,000 men in his household, and yet all of them had to be circumcised. And Abraham does not delay. It says that very day, verse 22. Imagine Abraham explaining this to his chief steward or his male servants, to Ishmael, and even to himself. But he did exactly. That's why he's called the father of the faithful. Abraham did not delay. Did exactly what God says. In verse 26 and 27, it says, that very day Abram and his son Ishmael were circumcised, and all the men of his house, those born in the house and those bought with money from a foreigner, were circumcised with him, to be a sign of that covenant. Okay, thank you for listening. If you have questions, email me. Anything that you want to talk about, we can do on the phone. Remember that I sent to you that study that I prepared about why the word everlasting does not mean eternal, time unending, but that for a long duration of time, an indefinite long period of time into the future, but that it would come to an end at some point. And so be sure and study that and look at it. Again, thank you for listening, and we look forward to our next study.